Alright, so I wanted to give you guys a really brief introduction to ZBrush, and just show you basically how to use the program. So by default, when you open it, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be pretty much nothing there. To actually import a model, actually there's probably going to be a bunch of weird menus and stuff up here. You can just close out of them, or you can open one of their test scenes. I think they have like horses and weird stuff in there as well. To get your own model in, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's this menu here. And you just want to go to the Import 3D Mesh button, click on that, and grab whatever model you want. In this case, I just have like a sad quad ball I've made. So when you click that, nothing's going to happen. To actually get it into the scene, you have to click, just regular left mouse button, click and drag. And I'm holding the left mouse button as I'm dragging. And you can see it'll sort of like rotate the model and scale it. Honestly, however it orients itself doesn't matter in the slightest later. So just click and drag to get it basically in the scene. And then you want to go ahead and click the edit button. If you do not click the edit button, which I always used to forget to do, it's going to just keep dragging. Anytime you click, it's just going to populate your whole scene with spheres. And it's going to get real weird real fast. And then you're going to hit edit, and you'll notice like as I'm rotating around, only one of these spheres is moving, and now there's just like 8,000 of them in my screen. If this happens to you, easy fix for that. Go into the layer menu up here, and just hit clear. And that should bring you back to only one sphere left. I don't know why that's a thing, but it is. So like at any point, again, if you just, make a crap ton of spheres by accident, just make sure that you click edit and then just layer clear. I'm sad to say it took me about 2 years to figure that out, and I was like, that's depressing. Anywho, so navigation in ZBrush is basically different than most other programs. It'll probably take you like a solid half an hour to not just be bumbling around in here. Totally normal. Alright, so basically clicking anywhere off of your object, like on the sides of your screen, with either the left or the right mouse button, will sort of toggle you, like rotate you around your object. If you use Alt and either the left or right mouse button, that will pan you around, and then zooming is Control and the right mouse button. Control and left mouse button is masking, and that is not a thing that you care about. So usually, honestly, I'll just sort of use the right mouse button for everything, just so I don't accidentally end up masking stuff by accident, because it's weird. The other kind of handy thing you can do in ZBrush, so there's not really like an orthographic mode per se you can go into. What you can do is if you hold down Shift, and then click with pretty much either the right or left mouse button, it'll sort of toggle you to something that behaves like an orthographic view, where it's basically just like a straight side shot of your object. So just sort of like position yourself more or less like where you want, and then just shift and then drag a little bit, and it should snap you right to the side there. So that's the basic nav. Again, pretty much left or right mouse button, just clicking anywhere is rotation. Alt, left and right mouse button is going to be pan, and then Control, right mouse button only is zoom. You can also, if you ever do something super crazy like this, where your object is like really tiny off the side and you're like, oh crap, where is it? If you hit F, it'll snap you to your object just like it would in Maya. So that's handy. Most of the time I'll put my object in the scene and maybe it's like really small or something like that, use that. So that's the basics of sort of navigating in ZBrush. If you want to actually modify your model, pretty much starts off doing that by default. So if you see, it's kind of like drawing on my mesh, and it's deforming it. This is no longer like a perfect quad ball. So I'm just going to go ahead and undo that because it looks crazy. And you have some brush options here. You have some more brush options here. The first thing we want to do, this is really, really low resolution. It's 98 polygons in this. So we want to add some more resolution to this. So we're going to go over into the right panel thing on your screen and open the Geometry tab. At which point, just hit Divide. There's also the hotkey Control D for that. But you'll see this is like smoothing out the mesh overall. And if you look at the active points in this mesh, this is basically poly count. You can see it's now gone up to 98,000 instead of 98. But now when we draw on this, it's much smoother and it looks way less trashy, and it's just overall better to work with. So quick note, I'm probably just going to leave this at 98,000. I might do one division lower. Don't be afraid to go up into like the 3 to 5 million range with your sculpts. I've gone up to 11 million. I'm on a laptop. It hasn't blown anything up. Because of the way ZBrush calculates sort of high polyness, it's incredibly efficient at laying out, or at dealing with high poly counts. So don't be afraid of that. Obviously don't put an 11 million poly mesh into Maya. It'll blow up very quickly. But in ZBrush, you shouldn't have a problem. All right, so I've added some more subdivisions. You can see that goes up now to almost 400,000. If you ever need to, you can scrub back and forth in this little slider in Geometry tab and get to, say, the 4th subdivision, and you can mess with that. If you go back up to the 7th, it should pretty much, go back up to the 7th, it should pretty much roll those changes over. So it's handy to be able to go back and see the different versions of the mesh. Also, at some point, you know, if you want to do like really large sculpting details, it's faster to do that at a lower subdivision level. I'll get to that more later. But if you want, you can delete the lower subdivisions. So like if I, on level 4, delete lower, level 4 is now my lowest subdivision level that I have. I'll undo that and I'll delete the higher ones, and you can see that now level 4 is my highest subdivision. I can't go any higher than that. And let's say you do delete the lower subdivisions. You know, I doodle some stuff on here, like, great. And this, keep in mind, will not work if you have tries in your mesh, which is really annoying. But if you want lower subdivisions, you can hit this reconstruct subdivision button, and it'll sort of like build you out lower subdivisions, so that you have them if you need them for stuff. In this case, it seems for some reason to have sort of gotten rid of some of my sculpting, which is weird. Honestly, I usually don't use that button too much. I just try to not delete my subdivisions unnecessarily. But either way, so we're going to go around and I guess let me actually do one more because I think, see if I can get this back. Okay, so this is what we started with. All right, so I'm going to show you some stuff about how to actually sculpt in this, because that's the fun part. Don't you dare crash on me. I have a sphere in you. This is depressing. Great. Oh, okay, cool. It's, oh, ooh. I don't know what my button's doing. It's gone insane. All right. So anywho, so that's basically all you should need for now to just sort of like mess with the geometry, or like the sculpting in ZBrush. The brush settings is where everything kind of fun happens. And ZBrush, like Photoshop and pretty much most other programs, it does have pressure settings, so if you do have a drawing tablet, it'll work really beautifully with that. I'm gonna plug mine in really quick and see if I can actually make mine register. It's been a little weird over the last few days. My tablet's like 7 or 8 years old, and it still works beautifully if the stuff, if it actually hooks up to my computer. So, you know, that's always fun. And nope, okay, great. So that's not a thing today. That's unfortunate. Anyway, well, it does accept pressure sensitivity settings. So anyway, by default, ZBrush is going to set you up with this standard brush, which pretty much does this. It just doodles. It's like a soft brush in Photoshop, basically. So up here you have different settings for draw size if you want to, you know, mess with that. You have focal shift. In Photoshop, if you were in Photoshop, this is pretty much like brush hardness. So you can see that that's, you know, it's basically like putting in like a little bubble instead of something like that. It's basically, again, kind of brush hardness. And then Z intensity is going to be basically how much this affects your mesh. It's kind of almost like opacity, sort of, but operating in a 3D scale. So all those settings are there. If you want, you can also just right-click pretty much anywhere in the viewport, and it'll pop up this menu. So ignore the color stuff for now. But you have access to all of that stuff there as well. Pretty much this entire little shelf they've just condensed into this. So Z-subtract is going to be, instead of drawing up from the surface, it's going to push down into the surface. So that can be handy depending on what you're doing. Or, you know, if you want to carve like a cavern into something, that's going to be a lot more helpful than trying to draw everything else up except that cavern area. So that's basically all of these. Smoothing brush is pretty much, if you hit shift on any brush, you'll notice in the side it'll toggle. I'm going to press shift toggles to smooth. I release shift, it goes back to standard. So I'll hit smooth and you can just draw over any of this and it'll go ahead and sort of round out any of the weird hard edges that are made. So one thing I do want to note really quick, and I'll probably mention this a few more times, is I said before it's a lot easier to make sweeping changes on lower subdivision levels. So the smoothing brush is a great example of that. So like on this, you can go in and you can see it's making really, really aggressive changes to the sphere. And if I go back up to my 8th subdivision level, that's more or less kind of been held in place. But you'll notice, like, as I smooth on the 8th division, where there's more geometry, it takes a lot longer to do everything, even on Z intensity of 100. So a lot of times what I do, if I need to, go and really, like, shave that corner down or something crazy, I'll go on to, like, the 5th subdivision level, kind of smooth that out, pop up to the 7th or something like that, smooth that out, and then it just goes much, much faster doing it like that. So that is usually why you want to keep those lower subdivisions around, because it is much easier to sort of edit stuff there. So you can also go and, like, with a larger brush, just sort of smooth over that entire side, go back, and you'll notice it's pretty much smoothed over that entire, wow, that looks really dumb. But it's gone and basically smoothed over that entire side of the area. Larger brush sizes also tend to make things faster. So if I, like, increase my brush size, it's going to make much more aggressive changes than having a super tiny, 30 pixel brush or something like that. It kind of looks like a face. Anywho, so the other thing you can do is actually, I'll make this less insane. If you don't want to go back and forth between Z add and Z subtract, like maybe I just want to, do something without having to manually click those buttons, you can press the Alt button. So as soon as I press Alt, nothing really changes in the menus. But so like normally it's Z add, press Alt, it becomes Z subtract. So that's pretty much just like an quick, easy way to access that. I am actually really liking this terrible face that I made, so I'm going to continue using this creepy face for the rest of the demonstration. Hooray! I hope you aren't terrified by this. Anyway, other thing to be aware of is sometimes it'll leave these like weird little brush marks if you go into a higher resolution. And you were sculpting, like I was on level 6 before, and now I went to 8, and there's like these little teeny areas you just kind of got to go through and just smooth out. But anywho, so there's different brushes. So if you click on this brush menu, you get a plethora of different things. I'm going to show you my favorite brushes. I am not going to run through all of these because that's madness. And I'll start with a blob brush because it's fun. I honestly pretty much never use this for anything, but it's just fun to watch jiggle, honestly. Like I don't even know what I would use this for. It's a very strange little brush, but it does, I guess, actually kind of give, if you were maybe trying to make like an icing effect or something like that, it does a pretty good job of that, I suppose. Or like toothpaste or welding, actually. I need to play with this more in the future. Anyway, the other thing that I use semi-frequently, sort of, not really, is the chisel brush. But it does a nice job of going through, you see it has like different little brush tips here. It'll go through and just draw like really harsh creases on your mesh. And if you intersect with it, you can see it basically is going at a uniform depth, so it makes these really nice sort of crisscross hatches if you need that as a feature in something. And like same thing up here, it's really easy to get those nice clean corners. I don't use it as frequently just because it's not something that I really mess with. It's not something that I need, but it is nice to know it's there. There's also these Chisel, if it loads, Chisel 3D brushes where you can stamp weird stuff like dog noses or elf ears onto things. And actually, for grins, I'm gonna stamp an elf ear onto this character. And all for this particular brush, it's set to drag rect. I'll go over that a little bit more, but basically you just click and sort of drag, and then you can move your mouse button around and rotate stuff. So this feels like an entirely reasonable thing. I'm gonna give this guy a better nose. Okay. Sorry guys, ZBrush is fun. Great. This should go in a modern art museum. There's also another one, which is Creature Chisel, and they have weird stuff like horns and scales and other random things that you can use if you need them. more on that later. So anywho, so other brushes I use frequently are the clay brush. This is one of my favorites. It's just, I don't know, it just behaves in a way that I find nice to work with. So what this will do is basically, you'll notice that no matter how many times I go over the same area, it's not really getting any thicker. And that's pretty convenient if you want to make just sort of like a large flat area and you just want to like sloppily sort of scribble on your stuff, and you can just go through and like smooth out that little top layer. And then if you want to do another layer, you can come back in with the chisel or the clay brush and just do more layers like that. So it behaves in a very sort of like stair-steppy way, which for some reason a lot of times I just sort of like. Similarly, there's clay tubes. That behaves more or less the same way, where you can go over the same area 30 bajillion times, and it's not going to do anything different until you release your mouse button and then draw on it again. So this is, again, something I use a lot to sort of like bore holes into stuff. It's pretty convenient for just making like very deep little holes in whatever you're working on. So I really like both these brushes. Usually I use the clay one, but sometimes I'll do clay tubes. The other one, it behaves similarly-ish, but it's called clay buildup. This one kind of has the brush profile of clay tubes, but this one, if you draw over the same area, it will most definitely get taller. Oh dear God, that's terrifying. I feel like this guy needs an aggressive chin. This feels like it would be an improvement. That's gross. But yeah, so those are sort of like my three main brushes that I go to a lot. This makes sense. Let's proceed. And I can just go into ZBrush and just sculpt all day. It's honestly super fun. But anywho, so those are, again, kind of our three main brushes that we have. The other one that I use super crazy frequently is this Dram Standard brush. And that, I don't know how to describe it, but basically it makes these really nice little sort of like squishy curve things and things. And I find this to be really, really helpful if you're doing stuff like that little line at the edge of the mouth or something like that, which is called the nasolabial fold, in case anyone's cares. But it's also really good if you use like a smaller brush. You can do like little wrinkles, which is very awkward with a mouse. I'm used to using a tablet with this. But you can do some wrinkles. You can do some really weird stuff like this. If I wanted to, maybe I could go in and like draw in his little, whatever that thing is, the back of his mouth. The name escapes me right now. But anyway, so I use this a lot for fine detailing, skin wrinkles, that kind of thing. Other helpful brushes are, let's see here, actually, I could use the Dram Standard to punch a weird hole in the bottom of his chin. That's an improvement. Great. Okay. Anywho, so yes, Dram Standard. Other thing that's helpful is the Move tool. There's a few different versions of Move tool. I usually just do the regular Move. So this one behaves, it's kind of weird. It's basically like dragging a little bit in, I guess, something like Photoshop. So what you can do is if you click on an area, you can drag it basically, how do I describe this? Perpendicular to the camera sort of space that you're looking, if that probably makes no sense. So if you're in like an orthographic mode like this, what you're gonna do, like if you drag this, it's gonna drag it straight out from the face. You see it's pretty much straight out from where my camera angle was. If I drag it here, it's only going to move in sort of in line with where my camera is looking, right? So it's not going to lower this at all, like it's not going to be able to pull it down this way. It's just going to be sort of where your camera is looking at the time, which sometimes is a little bit annoying. So you do need to make sure, like if you're, using it like this and you're trying to push the chin in, this isn't really pushing the chin in. What I'm actually doing right now is pushing the chin upwards. So that's just sort of something to be aware of. It makes way more sense if you just get in and start playing with the tool. I'm describing this very, very awkwardly. But you can use this to sort of make sweeping changes, decide like, the nose is like a little bit weird. Maybe I want him to have like a more aggressive little bridge of the nose or something like that. Or like push, part of the ear down, something like that. So it's just sort of good to be aware that that exists as a tool. This is really uncomfortable, guys. Other thing that I like a lot is two things. The trim brushes, usually I'll just do trim dynamic. What this is going to do is basically shave away material. So it's not pushing it around. All it's doing is basically cutting it off your model. So it can be pretty handy to, if you don't want to really change the form of things, like you're happy with all the shapes, you just maybe want to like if you're doing cheekbones or something on this guy and you just want to sort of like take some of the stuff off his cheekbone, you could do that. It's also kind of convenient if you ever need to create like easy faceting. Certainly a way to do that. It's decent for shearing off. Like if I wanted to square off the top layer of his face, that kind of thing, you can do that. So that's trim dynamic. And again, if you wanted to shear off his ear or something crazy. Trim adaptive honestly behaves very, very similarly. I just find it's a little bit harsher and for some reason harder to work with, but it does seem to behave more or less the same. That's weird. Anywho, I think the only other brush I want to show you guys is HPolish, and I can never find HPolish. Here we go. So HPolish behaves pretty similarly to the sort of trim dynamic brush. It's just basically what it's doing is it's going in and it just sort of, again, works a little bit differently, calculates a little bit differently. It's a little bit less harsh. I feel like you can get more organic sort of feels to it. But it goes through and it kind of squishes areas flat, basically. So if you have something like really rounded, like the top of this head, and you use HPolish on it, it's going to sort of flatten that area out. So I find this is, again, sort of handy just every once in a while. If you're looking to make a really stylized character with like harsh facial features, this is a great thing to use. I use that actually a lot. It's also good if you're just in the mood to make some kind of weird, faceted, like hammered metal look on something. I have no idea what this monstrosity is, but it's cool that we can do this in like 5 minutes in ZBrush. So other things to be aware of. Let me just go through and give this dude some eyes. Because he kind of makes me uncomfortable the way he is, just sort of staring at me soullessly. And I feel like it's only right if this guy has very differently shaped eyes. I think that's the only way I will ever be satisfied with this, so here we are. And this is me basically just using the clay brush, and I'm just clicking in the same area over and over to make these like weird little dimples. Oh, sweet goodness, that's so uncomfortable. All right. I really like this. I might save this out. But anywho. So other things that you can do that make it even more powerful to sculpt, I'm just going to go back to my standard brush. The other thing I should also mention is if you press B anywhere, it'll pull up the brush menu wherever you are. And it actually goes through, so you can press B, and then if you're looking for like the clay brush or something starting with the C, press C. And then from there it actually highlights everything that starts with a C, and then you can just click on it, or you can do the number values, or like the letter values for stuff. So if I was like B, C, and then B, it's going to grab my clay buildup brush. If you go B, C, L, that's my clay brush. So I've started learning all the hotkeys for the brushes that I use frequently. It's just very convenient. Like B, D, S is Dram Standard. B, M, V is Move, etc. So it can be a much more faster way, because I can never find anything in this. Alternately, BH will always bring up HPolish, because there's no other brushes that start with H. So anywho, and then you have the list of sort of commonly used brushes up here. I'm going to go back and find my standard brush. My standard, haha, cool. And I want to show you some other things that you can do with this. So one, you can grab alphas, and these are basically, like if we grab this, it basically will stamp based on wherever this white pattern is into your mesh. And you can also use the subtract with this if you wanted to make little recesses. This feels like it would be maybe really convenient to do like sunflower seeds or something weird with. So you can use different alphas. ZBrush comes with a bunch of them. They have like weird little, let me demonstrate on back of his head. They have like weird little triangles, crazy stars. They even have some stuff for scales. And they have these strange little like crack marks. Strange little crack marks there. So one thing I do want to mention, in case I haven't explicitly said this before, smooth brush, is if you're ever sculpting in ZBrush, and so maybe my brush size is a little bit smaller, boop, and you're like, wow, that looks really terrible in low resolution. If it looks terrible in low resolution in ZBrush, it's going to look terrible in low resolution when you export it out of ZBrush. So in this case, if you need to get resolution like that, you'd want to divide your mesh again to about 1.5 million polys in this case, and you'll notice that that is a lot smoother, at least until you get like really, really close to it. So that's just things to be aware of. Again, sometimes you just need to use more polygons. Can't really be helped. But there's a bunch of different alphas you can use. You know, you can drag them around like brushes to make some really weird sort of effects. And then, like, I have never found a use for this thing. Like, what is this? Very random. So like I said, they have some weird stuff for like scales, so you can make some interesting sort of scaly designs. Some of them patch together better than other ones. It is worth noting that focal shift does have an effect on these. So I set my focal shift down. Oh, this is actually a bad example. If I set my focal shift down to, this is actually probably a good example. All right, so focal shift of -98, pretty much almost nothing, is going to give me this. Whereas if I have a very soft focal shift, you can see that the focal shift actually sort of smooths off the brush itself. So if you want the brush with no effect from ZBrush just to be stamped exactly like it is, I'd suggest turning the focal shift all the way down. If you don't mind it getting sort of like that softer blended effect, you can turn your focal shift up. This actually feels like it would be a good thing for like almost like a pull and like those like weird chairs or something. I don't know how to describe that. Anyway, that's basically stamping. The other things that you can do is actually import your own alphas. So I actually happen to, if I can find it, haha. I actually bought alphas off of a dude because I was lazy and I didn't want to make my own. So in this case, they're all PSDs. I usually just export things as like JPEGs or whatever, but apparently you can import PNGs. So you can see this is like a custom wood alpha. And if I stamp this on my mesh, it gives me a nice wood grain. So you can import as many of these as you want. He also has stuff like fur, which I've honestly never tried any of these. I'm just going to kind of pick one at random. Great. Ooh, yes, that's gonna be fun. So they have stuff like fur. Now, depending, like in this case, this is not really useful functionality, and I want more control over how I put this hair, because that's obviously like not, that's pretty random looking and doesn't look amazing. So what you can do, this is so uncomfortable. What you can do is play with the stroke of the mesh. So by default, it's set to dots. I've not found a huge difference between dots and freehand. In this case, if you're doing stamping, a lot of times what I'll do is turn on drag direct if it's something like really specific like fur. And what that allows you to do is it pretty much disregards your brush size entirely, and it's going to go down, and as soon as you click, it'll let you do the thing earlier where you can like rotate and scale. So the farther you bring your mouse out from where you click is going to be a larger scale stamp, and then as you rotate, it'll actually rotate the position of that stamp. So I'm able with this to go in and really, really easily add in hair exactly where I want it, and sort of overlap it in, I am not going to call this a aesthetically appealing way, but in a, let's go with, in this instance, more controlled way than I was able to previously. Very, very strange. The worst kind of demo object. Alright, so the other thing you can do if you want is do color spray or spray. I usually do color spray. The difference is basically color spray is going to mess with the basically Z intensity, whereas spray, I believe, doesn't. I could be entirely wrong. But what that's going to do is actually, let me get something less. Stars, sure. But what this is going to do is basically if I click once, it's going to make a sort of random spattering of stars or whatever your brush shape is. So if you're looking to just sort of like scatter objects randomly, this can be a pretty good way to do it. And then you can go in and play with some of the settings of the stroke. So color intensity variance is, I've actually not played with a lot of these before. Alright, so I'm gonna go through and turn my focal shift down because I would like this to just be like as hard stars as I can. I think that'll make it a little bit more obvious what I'm doing. So you can go, if you put placement higher, it's going to basically scatter things farther from your brush. And you can see that every time I do things, it's randomizing where these are positioned. So I'm clicking in pretty much the same spot, and every time I'm just dumping stars somewhere else. But yeah, so I mean, just sort of play with these to get what you want. Flow seems to add more stars per click. So you can get some really interesting effects with this. Most commonly, if I'm doing something like this, what I'll do is I'll throw on an alpha, maybe like this weird little lumpy thing, and then I'll just sort of like, this is aggressively far and hard to control. So I'll maybe just do something like this as a really, like, just super quick and dirty way to get some texture into a mesh. And then if you turn the intensity down, you can just very, very quickly make this texture in like 2 seconds. So it's really handy for that. That is honestly like mostly what I use this for the color spray. I have no idea. This is so terrifying. And then drag dot is fairly similar. Go back to stars. So drag dot is similar to drag rectangle or drag rect, except this time it does care about your brush size. So it'll basically just click and then you can drag and like reposition this wherever. So this can be handy for something like buttons. You know, if you just want to do like a line of buttons and you're like, I clicked in the wrong spot, you can sort of like forcibly drag it back into the right spot for that, or you want to like ensure that something's equidistantly spaced. You have a lot more control with the drag dot option there. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much the basics of ZBrush. That was probably kind of a long and convoluted video, for which I apologize. Really quick, I'm going to show you guys a silly bonus thing that I will do a lot. So one is actually, ZBrush has an insane undo counter, so you can actually find it. There's like a scroll bar for it up here, but I can undo all of that. Or redo it. You can also do edit, undo, and there's a slider there. I'll show you a silly thing if you ever wanted to like 3D print this mesh, or you needed to work with the mesh outside of ZBrush, and that is Decimation Master. If you go into Z plugin, Decimation Master, you just want to hit preprocess current. That's going to basically stash your model temporarily in the computer, so it's way faster to work with later. I found this to be by far the most efficient, time-wise, and just generally the most robust tool for reducing poly count in a mesh. So you notice right now we have like about 1.5 million polys. By the time I get done with this, it's probably going to only need like 20,000 to hold all of this detail, which sounds like a lot. Still not something you really want to like dump into Maya, but it is just handy. Like again, sometimes you do need to 3D print stuff, and if you want that detail, you have to have it in the model. I perhaps should not have done a 1.5 million. It does sometimes take a little bit to process, but it's still, take my word for it, it's way more efficient than anything else I've found so far. I've tried like Mesh Mixer and a bunch of other stuff. Alright, so it's processed. We can go in, and this is basically the percentage, 20% of, how do I explain this? This is not reduce 20% of the geometry. This is I want 20% of the geometry remaining. So I would like, if I run this right now, it's going to be 20% of whatever this is. So about, I don't know, 250,000 or something like that. So go decimate that. And fairly quickly, it's going to go through and process that. And you can see it stripped it down to about 300,000 polys. And you probably didn't even notice an actual change in the mesh's surface, which is pretty crazy. So if we look at the wireframe, the hotkey for that is Shift F. So this is the 1.5 million polys. I'll decimate current. It strips it down a lot. Like you can see the topology change, but it does a really, really good job of sort of getting rid of geometry in large smooth areas, also probably like on the back of, oh wow, I forgot I had all this lumpy crap on the back of the head. Oh no, and the stars, I actually wanted those gone. But it does a really good job of getting rid of that. And then if you want to modify it further, you can just mess with the slider, take it down. So we're at 90,000 polys, and it's still pretty much holding all this detail, which is pretty sweet. And it's, again, going through and like it's focusing areas on like higher density. It's going to leave more topology there than it is on like the side of the head or like the random inside of this ear. So it's really handy. And then at that point, you should be able to just go ahead and export that mesh as a, sure, I'll save this in my downloads. Weird demo face. So you should be good to go ahead and just save that mesh as is. But yeah, so that is ZBrush in a very strange nutshell. I shall be return with more things that are related to displacement maps and other things.